Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Pascal. Ministers, ambassadors. Today we are presenting very proudly the WTO and ourselves at the OECD, the 2013 Aid for Trade at a Glance. And of course, this is the fourth presentation, but the important difference this time around is that it links it to the most forward of the research and the work that is being done both by the WTO and the OECD, which has to do with the global value chains and the trade in value added. And this puts the two things together and then explains why it is that the information on the aid for trade, besides simply documenting and illustrating the flows from donor countries to recipient countries, is actually helping to perfect and to make the global value chain phenomenon happen. It also opens up possibilities for practically every single country in the world for the reasons Pascal explained. The other one we're presenting today is Aid for Trade in Action. These are 269 cases of examples of why this thing happens and how it's happening in the ground and how it changes the life of millions and millions of people if we get it right. This is from 150 countries, 269 cases. And then, of course, you go into the sectors. Which are the sectors in which we want to focus? So, well, we went into, to start with some pretty basic things first. Global value chains in agri-food, related, of course, to the aid for trade. Then transport and logistics, very closely related to the former, because we still are wasting a third to 40% of the food. We're so worried as to whether we'll make ends meet with the food when we're 9 billion and we're wasting a third of the food that could be produced. So we're already halfway there to what we need in 2050, but we need the infrastructure, and aid for trade is the way to get it. Textiles and apparel, among other things, to create more decent, better working conditions so that we can avoid disasters and tragedies like Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, but also to provide for the opportunities to place these countries in the global value chains in the case of textiles and apparel. Tourism, a very obvious and very important and very critical set of possibilities. And last but not least, information and communication technology, both in terms of being hubs, serving those hubs, but at the same time serving the countries with the information and communications technology precisely to develop the trade and to develop the possibilities of the global value chains. So I will ask some technical assistance from the IMF. We have very good cooperation here so that they can get rid of this, just to the side. Now, I know that the WTO has gone paperless, so we gave all the members here this USB key, which has everything there, everything you always wanted to know about aid for trade, and we're afraid to ask. And it's available. I think we have a stand here, and there's just for all of you to take home. I don't want to be accused of causing a lot of trees to fall. But I have to say this is one of the most exciting success stories of the trade story. And I'd like to say how proud we have been to be working with the WTO and Pascal and his team. But also the success stories were recovered from all of you, from all the regional development banks, from the UNDP, from the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the IDB, ADB, etc., because they were the ones who provided all these stories. So thank you so much for that. Again, we're extremely proud and very, very encouraged for the results, very encouraged to keep on. This is, as you will see, the numbers are now getting pretty important. This is making a difference. Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, It is a great pleasure to present the fourth joint OECD-WTO report, Aid for Trade at a Glance, Connecting to Value Chains. We've come a long way since 2005, when we launched the Aid for Trade initiative in Hong Kong at the 6th WTO Ministerial Conference. Each successive global review has deepened our analysis and broadened our understanding of the dynamics of aid, trade, development, and their interaction. In parallel, more and more partner countries and donors have come on board as the tangible results of our efforts become apparent. We're also covering new ground. Our first report in 2007 covered 7 recipient countries, 7, and 39 donors. This year, we based our analysis on 132 self-assessment with 42 donors, 9 providers of South-South cooperation, 80 developing countries, including 36 less developed countries. And for the first time, we solicited the views of the private sector, and more than 700 firms told us what it takes for suppliers from developing countries to successfully plug into the global value chains. 3/4 of the 700, were from developing countries. And on the basis of these inputs, we now have at our disposal a powerful tool that is already changing the way we think about aid, about trade, and about development. This tool is in high demand. Indeed, our last joint publication received over 130,000 hits on the OECD and the WTO websites very soon after it was launched. Of course, the world has changed since 2005. The fallout from the global financial crisis has left a legacy of subpar growth, high unemployment, in which no country has emerged unscathed. We're still struggling to secure a durable recovery, but there is indeed hope. Activity is picking up in the US, notwithstanding the sequestration, by the way, and this is like, a vital economy there trying to break out of the bureaucratic and political problems and still saying, I'm still growing, at 2%, and still creating more jobs, more than 7 million jobs in the last 40 months. It's been growing, and recovering a lot of the jobs that were lost. Resolute policy intervention is starting to have an impact in Japan, Abenomics. And even if growth has slipped off late in the largest emerging economies, they are still and will remain important drivers of global growth. In this environment of hesitant economic growth, calls for protectionism are hard to resist, but we must resist them. Rather than sounding their retreat, governments should reaffirm their commitment to inclusive globalization, powered by free trade, open markets, and multilateral convergence. The 9th WTO Ministerial Conference in Bali will be an important opportunity to build momentum towards achieving these goals. We call on you, on all WTO members, to give the world economy a shot in the arm by agreeing a comprehensive package of trade reforms that includes agriculture and has trade facilitation at its core. Many of you are also exploring a range of bilateral and plurilateral agreements. And, you refer to them as second-best options to open markets. Again, we tell you every effort to ensure that such arrangements become building blocks rather than stumbling blocks of the multilateral trading systems will be fundamental. Everything we do now, if we build it like a Lego, where it can plug into a larger body, it will then be a building block. And that includes, of course, what's going on in Washington today and what's going on with the TPP and what's going on in Latin America with the Alliance for the Pacific. Now, easing the movement of imports and exports across borders can significantly reduce the cost of trade, particularly for developing countries. OECD analysis shows that comprehensive trade facilitation reform has the potential to reduce trade costs by as much as 15% in some developing countries. Now, think about it. Reducing global trade costs by 1%, just 1%, would in turn increase worldwide income by more than 40 billion, of which 65%, two-thirds, would accrue to developing countries. This is just reducing the cost of trade. It's not reducing tariffs. It's not negotiating anything. It's not getting reciprocity. Just reducing the cost of trade, which is going to be a lot of what Bali is going to be about. The potential of benefiting developing countries is enormous. The OECD and WTO have been working jointly to better understand the dynamics of national, regional, and global value chains, including in developing countries. At the OECD ministerial meeting last May, we released an update and an expansion of the OECD WTO trade and value-added database, as well as a policy report on how to maximize the benefits from value chains. The new work shows that developing countries can greatly benefit from value chains by concentrating on areas of comparative advantage. Value chains offer an easier path to economic development than building vertically integrated production processes from scratch. But they also raise costs for those countries that stymie the flow of goods, services, information, and people. We know that barriers to imports end up hurting exports by making them less competitive. Clearly, a very, very serious case of shooting yourself in the foot by avoiding or making imports more expensive. Our sector studies with the WTO and other IGOs demonstrate that developing countries are already well connected to value chains in textiles, tourism, agri-food, but that they're only a small taste of the possible. For their part, developing countries could capture more gains from trade and connect to more value chains by further improving their business climate, strengthening supply-side capacities, and enhancing connectivity to international markets. Today, in a strong statement of intent, governments and international organizations will come together to launch a joint statement calling for a WTO trade facilitation agreement and committing to help less developed countries implement it. Such an agreement would go a long way towards supporting the emergence of regional and global value chains, as well as the enhanced participation of developing countries in these fragmented production processes. Dear friends, since 2005, donors have allocated more than 170 billion to help developing countries achieve the goals of aid for trade. Due to the financial crisis, however, aggregate aid for trade declined to 41.5 billion in 2011. I have to say that all the flows of aid declined in real terms, now for the second year in a row. It's the first time this has happened since we started counting. And this obviously is not a good sign. There are shining examples. I'll only mention one. The UK has one of the tightest, toughest adjustment programs in the world, and still they're keeping their commitments to aid intact. So there you have a very clear example of the fact that if you get their priorities right, it is possible to help the neediest in the world, even if you are undergoing a very tough adjustment. Now, this decline in the aid for trade flows, it is attributed to a reduced contribution by G20 countries, who are now likely to fall short of their pledge to maintain aid for trade at the average level from 2006 to 2008. This was the commitment. This was the promise. These unfilled commitments are giving rise to missed opportunities, such as reduced support for the large-scale infrastructure projects needed to boost connectivity. On the other hand, Aid for trade for the lowest income countries has been relatively less affected, while aid to private sector development and trade development programs has become increasingly important. Commitments for trade facilitation projects, for instance, reached 380 million in 2011, giving us reason for optimism that we can progress this agenda in Bali and beyond. At the same time, South-South cooperation is also gaining traction in the aid for trade landscape as China, India and others ramp up their contributions. There is abundant evidence that aid for trade is having impact. It is lowering trade costs and improving trade performance. More specifically, OECD analysis found that $1 in aid for trade, $1 in aid for trade is associated with an increase in developing countries' exports of $8. There are very few things today that will yield an 8 to 1. Very few things. And this is evidence-based. This is not intuitive. For the poorest countries, the return can be as high as 20 to 1. So what best investment can we make? The impact is higher still for exports of parts and components, underscoring the benefits, again, of value chains and the benefit they can offer to developing countries. This analysis is backed up in concrete terms by the 270 aid for trade case studies incorporated in the previous global review. Examining these cases in detail has taught us that aid for trade in action works best when it is focused on improving infrastructure, facilitating trade, and supporting the private sector. Such programs are particularly effective when target countries have a supportive business environment, including stable macroeconomic policies and an investment climate that encourages private investment. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Monsieur l'ami, I'd like to conclude by emphasizing the central role of the private sector in trade. Policymakers can help to till the soil to foster commerce, but it is ultimately business that plants the seeds of growth. Our challenge is to engage better with the private sector to ensure that aid also promotes investment for trade. The Busan Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation offers a framework for ensuring that private and public sector funding streams are complementary. Today we have a great opportunity, and I say this here with Helen Clark as witness, great opportunity to build on this and other initiatives to improve the effectiveness of aid for trade overall and the effectiveness of development overall. I have every confidence that by working together we can strengthen aid for trade and cement its importance on the global policy agenda. Now, let me finish with something that I'm sure nobody has ever thought about, an extremely original, one time, it's never going to happen, never happened before, never going to happen again, and that is to acknowledge Pascal Lamy's work. And the great contribution to the advancements of trade and the contributions he still has to make on so many planes in both developed and developing countries. I think we all owe a very deep debt of gratitude to him. I can say personally it's been a pleasure, it's been a privilege, and Pascal, it's also been fun. I think everybody here feels deeply inspired by your service, and without a doubt will work passionately to continue your great work. Thank you.